Good morning. So I have had the privilege of participating, being a part of several weddings, actually much more as a bridal party than actually officiant. And so I've had a little bit of experience with this. I've spent more dollars on rented tuxedos than I would care to wish for. But there was this one particular wedding that I went to. And it stood out in my mind. It was a little bit unique in the preparation for it. So I got an email from the bride, I wish I could remember, a couple weeks, couple months in advance of whenever the wedding was. And basically said something like, excited to have you participating, blah, blah, blah. Like, read the document below. And so I said, I'll just print this thing out and take a quick look at it. And I printed it out. When I printed it out, it came out pretty much about this thick, I mean, it had every plan, every contingency. I mean, in there were plans for nuclear disaster, national floods, alien invasion during the wedding, and I was like, there's no way I'm reading this whole thing. And so I printed it out, took it with me, I put it in my tuxedo pocket. It looked a little awkward carrying something this fat around, but it actually did come in handy, much to my disappointment. Since that time, I've been over to this friend's house for dinner, and thank goodness, they did not send me that thick of an instruction manual for every time I visited their house. Now, you might say, well, why do you have that many instructions in the first place, to which I don't have an answer. But you say, well, what's the difference? Why for that one day was there such a thick manual of preparation and details and contingencies and plans, and then yet you go to the house for dinner and none of that comes with that? Well, I think it's because of the importance of that event. You could tell in the preparation how important an event was. And that doesn't mean that me going over to the house for dinner is probably unimportant, but the wedding was much more so, much more important. And so that preparation is there. Now when it comes to Christmas, I don't know if you're like me, you kind of get busy working and day in and day out, and then the next thing you know, you're like, oh my word, where did the time go? Next week's Christmas. And it feels like it's just sort of, like you kind of know it's like hanging around back there, like the stores start putting stuff out in July, but like all of a sudden it's like literally the week before, and you're like, how did we get here already? And I think sometimes our busy, frantic pace of life leads us to assume that there's this one magical evening in Jerusalem, Israel, and Jesus was born, and it came out of nowhere, and it was just this. It was incredible. It was spectacular. The angels were there, and it was this beginning of this plan. But we sometimes feel like the plan started there. And what I'd like to do this morning is take a look at the preparation that God had put in place for this plan. Now, there's a lot of different passages we could look at. There's a lot of different prophecies, which is when God speaks through a man or a woman before the time, saying, like, this is how it's going to go. Just like that wedding plan I got. God kind of lays out the details there because he says, this is what's happening. When you see this, I want you to know that this is all part of this plan. And I want to take a look at 3 this morning. And my hope this morning is that when we look at these together, that I like to look at them, they kind of look at the difficulty or the chances of these actually working. And then from there, I would like to just kind of be able to together just marvel in the fact that what we're celebrating on Christmas wasn't the start of God's plan, although it was the start of it on earth, but he had been preparing and planning and predicting and gearing up for this a long time. So by the time we get to what we call that first Christmas, that this had been the plan of God at work for hundreds of years. And so hopefully this morning, we look at these 3. Like I said, there's many others we could pick, but I'm kind of picking 3 sort of familiar ones because I want us to take time to just appreciate the context of them. Matthew is one of the gospel writers. He's one of the followers of Jesus, one of the apostles. He starts off and he says, in Matthew 1, he says, all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. You know what Matthew is doing here early in his book, like chapter 1 in his book. He wants us, as we're reading this, to understand, like, everything that's happening here isn't just like this, whoa, it came out of nowhere. No, everything that's happening was the fulfillment of God's careful plan throughout history. So he says all this took place to fulfill what God had spoken by the prophet. The first one we're going to look at this morning is Isaiah chapter 7. Here we have this king of Israel. He's struggling. He wants to do his own thing, doesn't trust in God. And we're jumping into the middle of this unlikely conversation. And it says, and again, God spoke to Ahaz through Isaiah the prophet. He says, ask a sign of the Lord. He says, he's talking to the king. He says, I'm going to deliver the people. I'm going to give you permission to ask anything you want to prove that I mean what I say. He says, let it be as deep as Sheol or the grave. He said, and as high as the heaven. So, that's a pretty broad spectrum, right? Here, through the prophet Isaiah, God says, hey, Ahaz, what do you want for a sign? Deep as the grave, high as the heaven, you name it. He says, but Ahaz said, and he can kind of get his pretend religious voice here, I will not ask, or I will not put the Lord to the test, Sounds all spiritual and everything. But God's the one that's offering this. God says, ask me, I'll give you a sign. He's like, oh, no. And I love the response of Isaiah. And he says, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Isaiah's like, look. He's like, is it too little effort that you exhaust the whole nation that you're supposed to rule? He said, you're trying to get God tired of you too? And he said, therefore, the Lord will give you a sign. So Isaiah says, through inspiration, through the Spirit of God working through him, he says, you're going to get a sign, buddy, whether you like it or not. Now, this sign is one that you're not going to be able to actually see come forth because you're just being a jerk. He says, therefore, the Lord will give you a sign. And what's the sign? He says, behold, a virgin shall conceive. He said, first thing is, a virgin is going to conceive. Second, and will bear a son. Now, thanks to our medical technology, there's always a stage in pregnancy where you can kind of tell if it's a boy or girl, and then they do all these balloons that you pop or cakes that you eat, and you figure it out, I guess. And but we can't predict what it's going to be. And people have guesses, right? But it's sort of a 50-50 thing. And yet here, the prophet's saying, no, you're going to conceive, a virgin is going to conceive, it's going to bear a son. There's a one-time shot at this, and, oh, by the way, the virgin is never conceived, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So, three very, very specific predictions here. So first of all, what's the prophecy? A virgin birth to one or to a son to be named God with us. What's the difficulty level on this? Impossible. Never before and never again has a virgin given birth. And yet here the difficulty level is impossible. Oh, and then on top of that we'll predict the son, and on top of that we're going to say what the name is going to be called. Now what's the time delay on this? And I think time delay is a very interesting component, right? Because if I predict something that's already happened, that's not that smart, right? If I say, this morning, you'll probably get song sheets when you come in. Well, you're like, well, duh, that already happened, right? But here, this is dated, most scholars date the book of Isaiah somewhere between 680 and 700 years before Jesus was born. 680 to 700 years. So if we're sitting here today, that would be like someone in the Middle Ages predicting not only that you're going to be here today, but something impossible is going to happen. Like literally, physically impossible is going to happen. Now, you say, well, what if the book was written and the Christians just want you to date it afterwards? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because there's this one shepherd running around the land of Israel, throwing rocks into caves because that's an awesome thing to do. And he hears this clank, and he realizes he broke some pottery, so they did some investigation. And they go up into these caves, and they found what is now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are manuscripts of the Bible that are written. Now, unfortunately for those who say, well, this was dated afterwards, those scrolls, there's a complete book of Isaiah there. And in that book of Isaiah, that's dated to 100 years before Christ. So even if you say, I don't buy the 600 to 700, Andrew, it's at least 100 years. 100 years prior. You think 100 years ago, someone predicting something impossible that's going to happen. This difficulty level is very, very high. In fact, near impossible. In Matthew 1, it says, now the birth of Jesus took place in this way. So Matthew here, he's writing a history. He's writing a biography. He says, I want you to know how the birth of Jesus took place. He says, when his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was still a virgin, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And remember, Matthew's conscious of what's going on here. He says, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. And we know it's the prophet Isaiah here. And in fact, he actually quotes Isaiah, just in case we kind of missed it, right? He wants us to know, like, this is exactly what Isaiah said would happen. And it's happening now. Prophecy number 1. Impossible prophecy, minimum of 100 years beforehand, most likely 680 to 700 years. If that's not enough, we have this book of Numbers. Now, I love this story in Numbers. This story in Numbers is fantastic. So you get this guy right here, right? So this is the children of Israel. They are walking into the land of, they're leaving Egypt. They're walking towards the promised land. And as they're going, it's this large group of people. People estimate 1 million, 2 million people. And they're going there, and all the nations around them are getting a little nervous. Like, what are all these people doing? Like, we just want to walk through. But they're like, like all these people. And so this one king has this idea. He's not going to attack them. So what he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hire a religious stooge to prophesy against them and to curse them. Now, you might not believe in curses, and that's fine, but that's what he thought. This was his plan. So he hires this guy named Balaam, which actually, in this story, is actually parts of it are recounted outside of biblical, the biblical text too. So we have this record of this guy named Balaam, and he goes up there, and you kind of get the picture. He's overlooking like the children of Israel in this huge valley kind of thing, walking through. He gets over there, and he's been hired. He's been paid to curse. It's kind of a unique job description. He gets there, and he's going to put this like spell or this curse on the children of Israel. Now, the only problem is when he goes to make this spell, God's like, nah, you're not going to curse my people. So instead, out of his mouth comes blessings on the people. Now, can you imagine being the king? You hired this guy to put a curse on the nation of Israel, and he goes and he says, blessings, nation, may you grow and prosper. Well, I want my money back. And so Balaam said, the king asked, like, what's going on? He's like, I tried, and yet God changed the words out of my mouth. And so they're like, okay, let's try this again. This time you really got to, focus, channel all that inner cursing. And so he goes up there, second time, does the same exact thing. He opens his mouth, and instead of cursing on the nation of Israel, comes out blessing. So they say third time's the charm. So the third time they get up there, and instead of just blessing the nation of Israel, he gives this incredible prophecy. He gives this incredible prophecy that we find here in Numbers 24. And Balaam, remember, he doesn't really believe in God, doesn't care about God, and yet through inspiration he says, I see him, but not now. So he's envisioning something in the future. And he says, I behold him, but not near. So this idea that there's someone he's picturing in the distance, and then he says, a star will come out of Jacob. The nation, he's looking down into the valley and cursing. A star is going to come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel. So instead of now just saying, like, I want you to be cursed, I want you to be destroyed, I want you to be eliminated, he's like, oh, in the future, this great king is going to come out of Israel. And a star is going to rise. Now, if that guy didn't ask for a refund, no one ever should. But here's this prophecy that's made here. Now, what's the prophecy? It's the special star, a special, unique star, indicates the birth of a future Jewish king. So that's what Balaam's saying. He's like, there's a day coming where a star is going to indicate that a Jewish king is coming. Now, what's the difficulty level? Well, you have to be able to control a star on command. I don't know about any of you. My parents have not told me that when I was born, a star came to rest over my hospital bed. I'm sure it happened to all of you, but I missed out on that somehow. We can, name stars. I think you can even pay to name a star, which I don't quite know how that works. But what you can't do is you can't have a star appear when you're born over where you're born. So if you can control the ability to create or command stars, you can have this, but if not, you're out of luck. What's the time delay on this? Well, most scholars put this about 1,400 years before Jesus was born. So we have, and these are the secular records as well, put this somewhere about that 1,400-year frame. That's a huge time span. So this is like, from us back to then, it would be sort of towards the end of the Roman Empire. they're kind of wrapping up this thing, and they're like, oh yeah, by the way, someday there's this president that's going to come who is a celebrity movie star. And we're all like, TV star. We're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, they didn't have TV. And yet that would be the span, like the time span of what we're talking about. 1,400 years. In Matthew chapter 2, some of you are like, I heard about the star thing. Matthew chapter 2 says, now after Jesus was born, in the days of Herod the king, so it's pegging a time frame, right? So it's giving us the time frame. It said, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who's been born king of the Jews? Why? And why did they say this? Like, they didn't get a text message, they didn't get an email, they didn't get a phone call. They said, why? Because we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. And some people believe that this prophecy, they read it right out of the book of Numbers. Others believe it actually came out of the Palestinian record of this, that also indicated the coming of a king with a star. But whichever record that they were looking at, whichever prophecy they were looking at, they understood that this star, this special star appearing, meant that the king was born, and they came to worship. Now, I think what's fascinating is if you read the rest of Matthew 2, is that a star is kind of a hard thing to fake, right? I mean, if I say, there's this star, and it's a special star, and it's led us right here, like the problem is everybody else can look up in the sky too, right? And you're like, no, it's the Big Dipper. It's been there for a while, right? And this is something it's tough to say. Like, I could say, there's this child coming that's going to have a special aura. Well, I don't know if you have an aura or not. So I can kind of fake that. But when you say, well, there's a star coming, the king and all his wise men look up and they're like, sure enough, there's a star. And in fact, they actually say, the king says to the chief priests and to the wise men, like, can you give these guys some help to figure out where this king is going to be born? Because he wanted to eliminate the risk, as we heard last week. So here we've got the wise men from a different land, a non-Jewish king, a Roman king, and Jewish chief priests are all authenticating this star that appeared based on the prophecy of 1,400 years prior. And a final prophecy this morning is Micah 5:2. It says, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. I like he starts out just by insulting the town. He's like, hey, Bethlehem, you're so insignificant. He says, you're a tiny, runty little town. He says, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. So what's the first part of this? He says, from this little insignificant town, there's going to be this ruler that comes. And then he says, whose coming forth is from old, from Ancient of Days. So you have this new ruler coming from an insignificant town who is, this idea of the Ancient of Days is this idea of eternity. So you've got this eternal king dropping into this insignificant town, and it's going to come from Bethlehem. What's the prophecy? You get the birth of an eternal king in Bethlehem. Now if you say, a birth of an eternal king, not many people fit that description right away. That becomes difficult. In Bethlehem. Now, think about this. If you were going to make a prediction, right? If you had to sit here today and say, okay, 700 years from now, let's predict where the next president of the United States is going to be born. I mean, we might try Chicago, New York, San Francisco. We go for like big cities kind of thing. I mean, we probably wouldn't try like Bowdoin, or maybe some of these other small towns in Maine, like town number 75 or whatever they call it. I mean, why? Because, well, your odds are bad, right? I mean, if you're just looking at statistical odds, you're going to pick the big cities. And here, Micah says, no, this is one tiny little place. And out of there is going to come the eternal king. Now, could you guess this hypothetically? Yes. You could also win the lottery, too, but you're also not very, very likely to do that. I think this is a really random chance. And what's the time frame on this? Well, this is somewhere between that 700 and 750 years prior. So 700 years before is prophesied in this little tiny village. Oh, and by the way, if you know Middle Eastern history, that whole region of Israel was constantly being attacked, conquered, with cities bulldozed. So you're picking a tiny, insignificant town, 700 years down the road, that it's in a war zone perpetually. What are the chances? Possible, but highly unlikely. Luke chapter 2 says, in those days a decree went from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And he gives this, like, the time frame on this. This happened first when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And they said all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph, he went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Now, if this was not hard enough, right? 750 years, we got a tiny, insignificant town, we're in a war zone. Oh yeah, by the way, the people who are going to be the parents to Jesus don't actually happen to live in Bethlehem. And they don't live there. So what happens? Well, this random ruler of Rome says, hey, this would be a perfect time to do a registration for taxation. And so everyone needs, and instead of just saying, stay where you're at, he says, let's mix it all up. Everybody go back to their hometown. And it's through this that Mary and Joseph make that journey to Bethlehem. And while, who was with child, and while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Oh, so it's not just any time. It happens to be probably right towards that 9-month time. You want to talk about a difficult prophecy. When Herod the king heard it, and all Jerusalem with him, they were assembling the chief priests, and he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it was written by the prophet. So this is going back to the story of the wise men that came. He's like, hey, where is the baby born? They again say, based on Micah, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Now, these are people who were not interested in what Jesus had to say. In fact, as a whole, they would largely be the ones responsible for putting Jesus to death later on. And yet they're like, well, if you look at the Old Testament, our best guess is in Bethlehem, in this tiny, insignificant little town. Here we got 3 prophecies this morning. I think just like my friend with that wedding preparation, is because the event was important to her, she went just to the nth degree to make sure it was prepared. And some of us, we may have started preparing for Christmas months ago, or we might have started, in 4 days from now. And yet, we kind of stumble on the event like it just sort of happens. It appears on our calendar. And yet, I think we take that mentality and we sort of assume, oh, that's how it was the first Christmas. Out of nowhere, a baby was born. They said, what a great occasion for a holiday, and let's change the calendar while we're at it. And instead of that, no, this was predicted carefully. We have location. We have to whom it was to be born. We have the name of the child. We have the fact that this is going to be indicated by a star. God's plan didn't start haphazardly on day 1, on what we call that first Christmas day. But instead, it was God was carefully working and building towards it and alluding towards it, starting over 1,400 years prior to the event. And what I think it's supposed to do for us is, first of all, it's supposed to cause us to have confidence that when this comes to pass, this isn't just any random child. This isn't a random coincidence. It's not that, like, oh, wow, why did we pick this one baby? Well, we're not really sure. It was probably cuter. No, this was the predicted, promised Messiah. This is God with us that was born. And it's supposed to give us this confidence, this idea that when it arrives, this is all part of the plan. Like, this is God's plan in action. But then I think it's also supposed to cause us to pause and to worship. And as miraculous as it is for it to occur on that day, the fact that it fits perfectly and fulfills perfectly the things promised. And we have others that were not friends to Jesus, not friends to what he stood for, confirming the same thing in the day. It should give us confidence that, yes, Jesus is the promised Messiah. Jesus is the one that history's been pointing towards. Jesus is the one that the whole Bible's been gearing up for. And because God didn't want us to miss it. He wanted to make sure that when that day come, we were ready. As important as that wedding was, and as important as it was for my friend to have me ready to do everything I was supposed to do, God wants us to be ready. He wanted those that were living in that time when they saw it, that light bulb clicks, and they're like, aha, this is the one. This is the one. This morning, we are going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And we're celebrating not the birth of Jesus in the Lord's Supper, but we're celebrating the final part of his plan on earth. The part of his plan where he wasn't just born as a baby in a manger and didn't just live a perfect life and didn't just teach good things and didn't just point us to God. But at the end of the day, he died for our sin. He died for our brokenness. He died so that we could have forgiveness. Because the plan, the miracle, wasn't just that a baby was born to a virgin, although that was a miracle. And it wasn't just that a star appeared, although that was just amazing. And it wasn't just the fact that it happened in this tiny little town against all odds. It was the fact that this was the beginning of God's plan for the Messiah on earth to redeem us, to pay for our sin, so that we could have forgiveness, so that we'd have that right relationship with God. As the ushers come and hand out the elements, I'd encourage you this morning, maybe it's just a good reminder, the confidence that we can have God in this plan. Maybe it's the opportunity just to thank God for putting these signs in place so that when it got here, we wouldn't miss it. Ask the ushers to come. As we take the bread this morning, remember Jesus' body that was broken for us. As we take the cup, we remember that his blood was shed for us.
I would invite you to please close in prayer, or pray for one prayer, if you would, with me this morning. God, please give me one person to share your love with today. In Christ's name, amen.